a warm welcome, a good morning, a good evening, a good afternoon. My name is livelihoods, working with ISD's infrastructure team and the Nature-Based Infrastructure Global Resource Center, or NBI Center. I'll be moderating today's session, and today is our second webinar of our deep dive series on how to value nature for infrastructure services. So while people are joining us, a couple of quick housekeeping rules. We'd like to ask you to keep your microphones on mute during the presentations, but there will be Q&A sessions today. And of course, you're most welcome to, at any point, use the chat function. We'll definitely pick up questions from there. That will probably be the most effective, but I'm also happy to hand over the mic for some questions, but feel free to write during the presentations as well. This series is part of our training offering of our Nature-Based Infrastructure Global Resource Center. Some of you may have been taking part in our 5-week training course last year, and many participants at the time told us it would be great to speak more about the specific case studies that we've been valuing, and give more examples. It would be great to hear actually who of you may have been part of the previous training session, so feel free to drop that in the chat as well. For those of you who are here for the first time, I just want to give a 2 minutes background on the NBI Center and our deep dive series here. The NBI Center is an initiative run by ISD with support from UNIDO, the Jeff and the MAVA Foundation, and we launched this initiative 2 years ago to support scaling up the use of nature for climate adaptation and infrastructure services. What we found is, at the time, one of the barriers, and probably still today, is really that we need, in order to scale up investment in nature, we need to understand its economic and financial performance. And today, in particular, when we compare how nature delivers infrastructure services in comparison with grey built infrastructure, we don't fully understand how it performs, and we don't understand how it financially performs. And that's actually what leads many of us, decision makers in the infrastructure process, it leads us to, by default, invest in unsustainable infrastructure. And with the NBI Center, we really try to change that narrative by providing more evidence that nature and NBI, such as sand dunes, mangroves, etc., provide cost-effective infrastructure services. And not only do they do that, on top of that, there's that wealth of co-benefits that they also provide and that actually help to make the case for investment in nature. Can we avoid investing in built water-related infrastructure by better maintaining forests or investing in mangroves or in wetland restoration? Because if we can, that will provide us with all those benefits. And that's really what we're here for today. But it's critical that we invest in better methods for valuation to be able to answer some of those questions, to be able to value infrastructure services and benefits, because otherwise it will be very, very hard to get governments and investors to make investment flow into nature. So we are on that mission for the next few years to provide as much evidence as possible, and to also improve continuously the methodologies on how we value nature. Now, we've been working a lot with integrated valuation methods, with scenario analysis, and they've been proven to be key tools for helping investors and planners, policymakers, decision makers in the infrastructure process to make informed decisions about investing in nature versus the otherwise conventional grey infrastructure. And in today's webinar, I'm really pleased that we'll be zooming into what I think is a super interesting case study, where we've looked at not only the value of wetland restoration in an area prone to flooding in Colombia, in the region of La Mojana, but we've also looked at what hybrid infrastructure or what hybrid options to protect against flooding might look like. And for today's presentation, and to zoom into what we found in that assessment and how we found it, I'm really pleased that we have with us today my colleague Georg Palaska. Georg is a system dynamics modeler, and he's worked with us for a long time. It's one of the architects behind the Sustainable Asset Valuation methodology and the incorporation of Copernicus climate data into our assessments. And Georg will be presenting to you this case study today. We also have other colleagues from the NBI Center here. So I want to thank in advance Morten and Eduardo and Becca, who are here with us as well, and who'll be happy to support you should you have any issues during the training, but also should you have any questions, we'll be picking them up from the chat. Without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Georg, so that we can all together learn more about this case study in Colombia. If you have any questions, do drop them in the chat. But for the rest, Georg, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisbeth, for this comprehensive introduction, and also from my end, a warm welcome to everybody who is on this meeting, on this webinar. And I will now speak a little bit about the context of the assessment for the La Mojana region that we have conducted together with the Department of National Planning of Colombia, and then go down a little bit into the process as to how we conduct these assessments, the dynamics that have been considered, and then we dive a little bit into the scenarios, the main drivers, and also the outcomes of the analysis. So the assessment of the La Mojana region focused on the quantification of co-benefits that result from the implementation of flood protection measures. And as Lisbeth has already highlighted, there are various measures that have been considered by the DNP, whereby the DNP has considered a hybrid approach of infrastructure for mitigating flood risk. And so you can see on the graph on the right here, we have channel rehabilitation, we have wetland rehabilitation, which are considered NBI. We have the construction of, or the extension of, an existing dam to protect more land, make more land available also for the local population. And this kind of systemic assessment we have conducted using the Sustainable Asset Valuation methodology, which is an approach that looks at the system as a whole and attempts to quantify as many impacts across the system as possible that result from the implementation of interventions. And as already highlighted, the assessment was co-developed with experts from the Department of National Planning, which I will refer to in the following as DNP. And now before we start looking at the dynamics, take a quick look at the process that we usually follow when implementing a SAVi assessment. So in essence, we have this 7-step process of SAVi, whereby the first 3 are engage and learn, collect data, verify data, and confirm scenarios. So these first 3 kind of relate to the framing of the assessment. So during this stage, we engaged extensively and intensively with our project counterparts, in this case from the DNP, to find out what are the exact impacts that we shall analyze and what is the exact framing that the analysis shall take. Because all our project partners are specifically interested in the quantification of some benefits. And so this is our point of departure for model development, and from there we expand. And the collaboration with the DNP in this case is very important, because otherwise it is hard to generate the knowledge that is necessary to inform decision-making and to inform policy-making. And the collaboration with the DNP is also important, because we then relatively quickly find out what data is available and what scenarios shall be simulated. And so based on that initial framing of the assessment, we then depart into the development of the mathematical model, and then we run the simulations, we crunch the numbers, and we come up with the preliminary results, which is done by means of scenario analysis. So usually all of our of our assessments, they use a baseline scenario, which is either the current status quo or which is the scenario of inaction, depending on the kind of framing of the assessment. And then we run intervention scenarios on top of this. And so intervention scenarios would then look at, for instance, only the implementation of the dam, only the implementation of channel rehabilitation, and so on and so forth. And so once we have generated initial results, we then go back to our project counterparts and we validate the outcomes of the analysis with them, because they are the experts when it comes to the local conditions, and they know exactly what are national trajectories with regard to, for instance, economic growth or population growth, all of those indicators that are also important in our model to consider. Given that, and we will see this a little bit later down the road, population is also one of the main drivers in the model. So first we frame the analysis and structure the analysis model together with our project partners. Then we design the scenarios, we run the scenarios, and we validate the outcomes and trends. And during this first validation phase, usually a lot of questions come up, and then we are able to refine the model, refine modeling assumptions, and maybe also expand the modeling scope by a little bit, because in the process, it turned out that there was the one other aspect that has not been included, which is then included for the final batch of simulations. So once the feedback then has been included into the simulation model and the analysis, we then rerun the simulations. We prepare the final outputs in terms of, we prepare a report, we prepare a PowerPoint, we help with outreach if needed, and also with capacity building if our clients want that. And so while this is presented as a very linear process here, in reality, it's quite iterative, and it can go from one phase back to the other. So it can, for instance, go from 4 back to 2 or back to 1 even, and then we run through all the phases again until we finally reach stages 6 and 7, where we actually present the results. Now, the underlying methodology that is used in almost all SAVi assessments or all NBI assessments is systems thinking. And systems thinking is very important, as we have found, because what we want to find out, or what we want to look at, is the infrastructure asset that we want to analyze as a part of the environment where it shall be implemented. Because many traditional assessments focus mainly on the performance of the asset as such. But infrastructure is becoming, or has always been, a mainstay of development. And given that we want to develop further, and the nature and humanity grow increasingly interconnected, and we can no longer neglect negative externalities, what is important is that we are also able to forecast the infrastructure assets' impacts on the systems. And systems thinking is the methodology that helps us to conceptualize by looking at the interrelationship rather than individual things, and then patterns of behavior rather than static snapshots. And so in doing so, we kind of gain a more comprehensive perspective as to what are the consequences of action and also of the choice of asset to be implemented. And then this helps us to generate exactly that kind of information that is required to inform a specific decision-making process, that then also takes into account the interdependency of different indicators within the system, and thereby provides the basis for more informed decision-making also when it comes to medium and long-term consequences of action. Now, I will present the causal loop diagram that we have developed in collaboration with our project counterparts. And so we start out with total population, as we can see here in the middle of the screen. And population is one of the main drivers, because if the La Mojana region has traditionally been a wetland area that has always served as a water retention area, so this is one huge wetland, and over time more and more people have moved there to make a livelihood, in part because of the pristine area, but in part also because of conflicts in other parts of the area. So there has been a growing population in that area, and with population came settlement land and infrastructure. So people move there, they build their houses, and then there's roads, there's buildings, there's power generation. So more and more assets accumulate there over time. Now, furthermore, the people moving there also want to make a living, and one of the primary means of income in the La Mojana region is agriculture. And so as population moved there, we have more land that is used for crop production and more livestock that is bred. And that is on the one hand for subsistence purposes because people need to eat, but on the other hand also for economic purposes because the La Mojana region is having a huge livestock herd to what I've heard from the DNP counterparts. And so historically there has already been a dam constructed in order to kind of, on the one hand, make more land available for productive purposes, cropland and livestock, but on the other hand, also to protect the land that has already been established. Because if you have a plot of land or if you have livestock, then a flood is one of the worst things that can happen to you, because when there's flooding, you may lose all your income. And so if we now want to go one step further, then we see that the crop production and livestock production generates value added from agriculture. So we produce beyond what we need to eat, and thereby we can sell produce in the market, we make an income, and there's profits being generated. And as this economic opportunity is realized by people in other parts in the country, the La Mojana region, of course, becomes more attractive for people to move there because that's an area that is relatively safe from conflict and where you can make a living. And so in doing that, we close two reinforcing loops. And a reinforcing loop in system dynamics or in systems thinking is a loop that leads to exponential growth or exponential decline if regarded in isolation. So I will take the example of crop production. So the more people there are, the more land will be used for crop production. The more land that's used for crop production, the more value added will there be from agriculture, the more attractive the area will become, and then the more people will move there. The same applies to livestock. And so the opposite of a reinforcing loop is a balancing loop, which is presenting or constituting kind of the limits to growth, but we will talk about that in around a minute or two. Now, as more people move there and as more settlement land is established, automatically there's land conversion taking place. And so that's why we consider population one of the main drivers, because as population grows, land conversion also increases away from natural areas towards more man-made areas such as settlement land, but also cropland, for instance. And so in doing so, over time, the increasing population and the land conversion that came with it has encroached the natural wetland area and forest cover, both of which are land use type that kind of are natural soil cover and that increase the water retention capacity of an area. That in turn makes so that depending on the water in the river and of course precipitation and the water retention capacity, there may be flood events. And so flood events have historically always taken place in the La Mojana region, and the diminishing water retention capacity makes so that more water runs off into the river, so we have higher water levels, which increases the risk of flood events. Then an additional effect that an increasing population density and the livestock density that came with it had is that cattle needs to graze. And as cattle is grazing, it densifies the soil. And now the denser the soil is, the less water it can absorb, this, which means that more water will run off. And at the same time, also the grazing itself reduces the natural soil cover as the grass is sometimes ripped out together with the roots, which also changes the alteration of the soil cover, reduces the natural soil cover as such, and by that diminishes water retention capacity even further. So then we see that two additional elements have been added here. The one is flood events lead to damages to infrastructure. So that means that the more infrastructure we have and the more flood events there are, the more the potential for damages is, the higher the damages are. So the other aspect that has been added here is a feature that was introduced by the dam. So historically, the flooding as such has always carried fertile sediments onto the soil, which means that there was a refresher of nutrients over time that contributed to maintaining soil fertility. As you build a dam, this natural flooding no longer occurs. So that means that while historically there have always been sediments being washed onto the soil and contributed to fertility, those sediments are no longer there, which means that there is a decline in soil fertility that comes over time as agriculture is conducted on that land. So, and that in turn means that more land is being required for crops and livestock, which in turn leads to additional conversion of natural soils, and thereby exacerbates the problem. Now, if we want to look for a moment further at the damages to infrastructure, what happens here then is that as there is a flood event, infrastructure is damaged and population is being affected by flooding, which means that we have people that are in need of shelter. As flooding, depending on the intensity of the flood, there may be waterborne diseases afterwards. There is increased need of healthcare and related costs. And that means that as population is affected by flooding, of course, the area is no longer that attractive to being like inhabited. So some people that may have been affected by floods leave the area. So this is where we see a balancing loop, where we have population growing, settlement land growing together with infrastructure. But then as infrastructure gets damaged and population is affected, some people may move away, thereby somewhat balancing the amount of land that is occupied by infrastructure. And the same applies also here, because as population moves away, there may be less livestock that is bred in the area, there's less cropland that is used, and so there's more of a chance of natural soil cover taking over again, kind of mitigating the effects of on water retention capacity that have occurred through human interaction. Now, lastly, an additional factor that was also highlighted by the people from the DNP was the water retention capacity, and that is the La Mojana region is increasingly facing water scarcity in dry months, although it is a wetland area. And so that also comes because the water retention or the percolation rate, so the groundwater recharge, is less good than it was historically, which means that during dry months you may face water scarcity. And so this is now an example as to where policy or how policy can fit into the picture. So in this instance, we see that we have added livestock intensification, where we would have more livestock in a smaller area, which would kind of mitigate some of the impacts that would come from the grazing on water retention, because if livestock is grazing on a smaller area, then the larger part of the area is not as densified as it would be. And that in turn would maintain some of the absorption capacity and reduce the risk of floods. And so this is how we step by step build the complexity, also together with our stakeholders. And then we have the narrative that is required to set up the assessment, to analyze the status quo, and also we know what pressures need to be mitigated. And I think that this may be a good point in time to stop for questions, because after the next part of my presentation is going to focus more on the damages, on the scenarios that were simulated, as well as the outcomes.
Thank you so much, Georg, for this explanation of what the first part of an assessment often looks like, which is really to try to get a comprehensive view of the dynamics around a project, and we need use that mostly to create that common understanding, as you mentioned, of what the dynamics are. I don't know if there's questions. I don't see any specific questions in the chat for the moment, but I don't know if there's any participant who would like to take the floor and has any questions around the causal loop diagram. There's one question, Georg: is any impact expected from the waste from cattle?
The waste from cattle as such was not. It did not come up in the conversations with the DNP, because the the main focus of this assessment was the remediation of flood damages, because I think also during the year of the assessment, which was I think last year, I also read a news article that in part people had to go by boat to go boating in the Mojana region because it was prolonged flooding there. So there were villages that were flooded for a month or more. So that was kind of the main focus of that project, and hence the waste of cattle did not show up as a priority area. Although one could now say that the waste of cattle, depending on the quantity that there is, in part may contribute to soil fertility on the one hand, but if too much, then of course you have negative impacts on water quality and an erosion of ecosystem service, or of ecosystem quality. That is certainly something that can be considered, but it was not mentioned by the stakeholders.
Thank you, Georg. That's indeed what Deborah alluded to, the potential impact on water quality as well. I think, as you're explaining, is something we can take into account in this assessment, but was not coming up in the discussions as such.
Yes, I think that like the beauty and the curse of these assessments is that the deeper you go and the more you map the dynamics, the more aspects that you may want to focus on may emerge over time naturally, because you go deeper into the matter even further. But at some point it is required to kind of determine the boundaries or define the boundaries of the assessment, because otherwise this becomes endless and the initial focus of the assessment kind of fades into the background.
Thank you, Georg. There's another question from Tatiana. What covers were taken into account in the forest cover relationship? And did you include mangrove/swamps, mangrove swamps as wetlands specifically?
So this assessment as such did not consider different types of forest cover. We will see this in a couple of minutes when I go through the results, but essentially what we considered is urban areas and settlement land, forest cover, wetland area, fallow land, and agricultural land. So this is kind of the level of aggregation at which we have modeled land use. Although in parallel to the system dynamics modeling that I'm presenting here, we also conducted a spatial analysis. And the spatial analysis, I think, considered some 25 or 30 land cover class, and I'm sure that mangroves were among them.
Okay, I think that's a nice segue, Georg. There's no further questions at this stage. So should there be any, do drop them in the chat. In the meantime, back to you, Georg, for the second part of the presentation.
Great. So maybe before I advance into the next part of the presentation, what I forgot to mention in my introduction of the SAVi process is that we do not only do systems modeling and we do not only use systems thinking. So the Sustainable Asset Valuation methodology is somewhat of a toolbox that combines different methodologies. And so the more recent assessments almost all include a systems thinking component, which is where we identify relationships. Then system dynamics component, which is required to kind of quantify and forecast specific biophysical impacts, a project finance component, which is where the information between the system dynamics model is exchanged with our financial modelers, Eduardo and Morten also on the call, to conduct a more detailed financial assessment of the outcomes that we are forecasting. And at the same time, the information generated using the system dynamics model is also used to conduct spatial assessments, so to create future land cover map, and then to assess by means of GIS and INVEST how ecosystem services may change. But I will speak to that in a moment. So that just to say that we always fit the analysis tools to the project that we are working on, not the other way around. So it's not that we have one predefined methodology or tool that we apply to every project that we have, but we engage with our project partners and determine together with them what methodologies may be best suited to answer the research questions that we are facing. Now, let's get back to the La Mojana. In brief, the damages that were considered in the system dynamics model are operationalized based on water flow data, because the water flow data is the one single main driver of potential floods. As water levels increase beyond the threshold, there's a risk of flooding, which means that to an extent, smaller or larger, infrastructure and cropland may be affected. And so what we then considered in the assessment is the flooding of cropland. We resulting reductions in yield by means of water scarcity, the loss of livestock due to flooding, and damages to infrastructure, namely roads and buildings. So the outcomes of the assessment are usually summarized in form of an integrated cost-benefit analysis. And the integrated cost-benefit analysis, or integrated CBA, kind of provides a comprehensive overview of the investments, the cumulative investments, avoided costs, and added benefits that result from the implementation of investments. And so what we see in the table here is cumulative values in billion Colombian pesos for the period from 2022 until 2050. And so what this kind of a tool, an integrated CBA that is, allows is to look at what is the total cost that we are facing for the implementation, and what is the total impacts quantified, monetized at system level that are resulting. So, and here we see the investment into the different interventions. We see that there is investment in costs, avoided costs, and added benefits. And I will first point you to the row down here, which is the total avoided costs and added benefits, which is essentially the total benefits that result from the implementation of specific interventions. And so in doing that, we do not only look at the merits of the individual infrastructure asset, namely a dam as such, if implemented, does not necessarily have a revenue stream. But on the other hand, the investment for the dam is definitely justified if it contributes to avoiding more flood damages to buildings and infrastructure or adverse impacts on the system in general, than it costs in terms of money. And so what we find from this assessment is that the total avoided costs and added benefits range from 145 billion Colombian pesos in the case of the wetland rehabilitation scenario, to around 14.15 trillion Colombian pesos in the scenario that combines all interventions. And so, given that there's no negative number here, we see that all interventions generate a net benefit at system level. And what we also found is that the simultaneous implementation of all interventions at the same time generates synergies that make so that the total avoided costs and added benefits that are found in the all investment scenario are larger than the sum of the individual interventions here. But more about that at a later stage in the presentation. So first, let's take a look how we got there to create this integrated cost-benefit analysis. And so, as I have already mentioned in the description or in my explanation with regard to the SAVi process, what we do is we use scenario analysis. And so here you can see the scenarios or the intervention scenarios that were considered for this assessment. So we have the business as usual scenario, which is the current situation continues to play out as is, and there's nothing being done to mitigate or remediate the flood risk and flood damages. And what does that give us is a baseline situation that can then be used to analyze how damages change and how systemic key indicators change if we intervene in the system, either by constructing a dam or by maintaining the channel infrastructure that has been implemented by the indigenous population and maintained also for a long time. If we introduce sustainable agriculture, so more climate smart agriculture practices, and or if we restore a wetland, or if we implement all of these interventions together. Now, The key features of the simulation model are, as I had already mentioned, that the model as such, the scenarios were co-developed with experts from the DNP, who then also validated the simulation outcomes and made sure that some of the trends that are already known are correct, such as, for example, population growth. Then the two key drivers in the simulation model were population, as we have seen in the causal loop diagram, because of the land conversion component and its impacts on water retention, and water flow data, given that as the threshold is reached and there's flood events, there are flood damages. So those were the two main drivers in the model that were driving behavior. Now, for the development of the model, we integrated data from relevant sources such as statistics, water monitoring stations, spatial models, planning documents, scientific publications, and also stakeholder knowledge. So we received information from the DNP on the ambition for the respective interventions, as well as related costs and, where available, also employment. And all of that information was harmonized and integrated into one analysis framework to make sure that all the bits and pieces fit together and are validated thoroughly before we run this assessment. Then, as I just mentioned, the data on the ambition and costs was provided also and provided and validated by the DNP. In addition to the system dynamics analysis, we have also conducted an inverse assessment, also the spatial modeling, and the system dynamics model was thoroughly validated by using both structural as well as behavioral validation techniques to make sure that the model structure is sound. And one of these is, for instance, that we start simulating in the past. So in this instance, I believe that we start in the year 2000, and then we simulate until the year 2050. And so by assessing to the extent to which our model reproduces the last 20 years, we gain confidence that the structure that we have developed generates the right behavior for the right reasons. And so as we build this confidence also together with our project counterparts, we gain more confidence that the forecasts that we are generating are also in the ballpark. I mean, all models are wrong, but some may be useful. And so we definitely aim for the useful part. And so we know that it will not be perfect, but we do our very best and use the techniques required to ensure that it is as close to reality as possible, to make sure that we can reduce the uncertainty with regard to the costs and systemic impacts that is involved in the policy-making processes and the decision-making processes involving infrastructure investments. So now, just as an example here, in the baseline scenario, we see on the right, we see the graph for total population, and we see that population increases to around 610,000 people that live in the that live in the Mojana region. What I would like to emphasize here in this graph is that we see the data is the red line, and the red line underlies the blue line here. So we see that we match the projections up until 2035 very nicely, and from there we extrapolate. And so, as already mentioned, total population is one of the main drivers for land use change, and also for the change in cropland and the change in total livestock in the La Mojana region. And the land use dynamics in the model can be depicted as this. So we see now here the 5 land cover classes that I had mentioned earlier. We see we have forest land, we have settlement land here, fallow land, wetland, and agricultural land. And the black arrows that we see here are the flows. So we see that there is a circular relation, we call it a feedback loop, between forest land, agricultural land, and fallow land, which is essentially describing the dynamic that we do have forest land where there's fertile soils. And then there's deforestation for agriculture, which means that forest is cut down or burned to free up land for agricultural production. And then this land is used for agriculture, and depending on the way that it's managed, it may deteriorate sooner or later. And so by losing fertility, that plot of land is abandoned and becomes fallow, and more forest is cut down for crop production. And so in that, we see that agricultural land and settlement land being driven by population, And so by the increase in those two classes leads to a decline in forest land, fallow land, and in wetland. And so now, if in case you were wondering why there's this huge dip here, or this huge spike in land in the data, that is because of the land cover data that we have used to inform the modeling, but I will speak to that on the next slide. And so what we did essentially is we received 2 land cover maps, 3, for the year 2000, for the year 2010, I believe, or 10, and for 2018. And the land cover map for the year 2010 showed a disproportionate amount of wetlands. And so then in doing some, and that we flagged to the stakeholders of the DNP, and we said, okay, how can that be? How can it be that in the 2010 and 2018, there's a consistent amount, but in 2010, there was so much? And so we engaged in this conversation. And what turned out is that in the year 2010, they had an extraordinarily strong La Nina event. And so that led to vast amounts of flooding and the loss of cropland and settlement land. And of course, then when the satellite picture was taken that was used to create the land cover map, a disproportionate amount of wetland because the water was still being stored there. But if we now go back to the land use modeling that we have conducted, we essentially decided to use the land cover maps for 2000 and 2018 as the baseline, and to regard 2010 as an outlier. And that was communicated with the stakeholders from the DNP, and we proceeded based on that. And so what we then did is we used the land cover data, including some of the some additional inputs to run ecosystem service assessments, such as, for example, carbon storage, habitat quality, water yield, and sediment and nutrient exports. So I will just go through these slides rather quickly because I realized that I may be a little bit short on time and I want to leave some space for questions in the end. So these are the maps that you can see for 2010, and here are the land cover classes that I had mentioned earlier, 2010 here, and then 2018. And so the outcomes that we generate here is, for instance, for carbon storage, we see that between 2000 and 2018, there is a 4.3% decline in carbon stored in the area attributable to deforestation and land conversion. And as a consequence of land conversion, also mean habitat quality has declined by 5.4%. So the policy scenarios that were simulated in for this assessment were 5 that we have regarded earlier. So let's take a quick impact at the interventions and a quick look at the interventions and the impacts. So we have the dam construction, we have the channel restoration, sustainable agriculture on this slide, whereby the construction of the dam is assumed to make more land available, but will lead to the congestion of some channels. So it will contribute to mitigating flood risk, but at the same time also damage some of the infrastructure that is already in place to keep floods at bay. The restoration of the channels assumes a restoration of 800 channels that are currently blocked because they have not been well maintained, so that water can flow to retention areas. And the sustainable agriculture scenario is more focused on the producer side, in that it assumes somewhat higher water retention, but then also higher yields. The other 2 scenarios are wetland restoration, which is where we assume a restoration of 2,220 hectares of encroached wetland, which increases water retention capacity, and the oil investment scenario that kind of includes all of the interventions that we have seen at the same time. And now just to take a quick look at how some of that looks in the dam construction scenario. So we see that based on the studies that we have seen, the dam leads to around a 10% reduction in flood risk. And at the same time, it also increases the amount of agricultural land that is available for productive purposes, which we see here in the blue line, which is the dam construction scenario. Here we can see the impact on channel infrastructure. So a portion of channels is lost due to the construction of the dam, but overall we see by the blue line and the spikes here being lower than the red line, that the overall flood indicator and the flood risk is lower compared to the baseline, which means that there is, despite the impact on channels, a net positive effect on flood risk. That then in turn affects, for instance, the share of cropland that is flooded, total crop production, and then the foregone production from agriculture, whereby those spikes look very dramatic. But what I need to say here is that they are averaged across the year. So it's not that there's like almost zero production in a given year, but that is a kind of monthly impact. And by averaging, then we see that I think it's a 15 to 20% decline in yields that is caused by floods. And then by integrating all of this information and by quantifying, for instance, the damage to roads based on the kilometer of roads that is damaged, by the damage to buildings based on the number of buildings that are damaged and the cost of buildings, the damage to agriculture using the cost of cropland or the value of production, we can then see that we have the avoided costs, which is damages to buildings, roads, and agriculture, and added benefits, which is value added from crop and livestock, as well as related labor income, that they by far outweigh the initial costs, investment costs that are indicated for each of the analysis. And so down here, the last thing that I want to mention on this slide is the avoided costs and added benefits, which is per Colombian peso invested, which is kind of the ratio of total benefits to total costs, which ranges from around 2.07 in the wetland rehabilitation scenario, via 5.7 for the all investment scenario, to a very high ratio of 26.1 in the channel rehabilitation scenario. So this is just one additional indicator that provides insight into how interventions perform with regard to the initial investment required. Now I will skip the slides on uncertainty. We can also conduct scenario analysis to kind of look into what is the range of damages to agriculture, roads, buildings, and in total that would result if we would change the damage assumptions, and just briefly show or go into the key findings, which is that the combination or investing in the combination of nature-based and conventional infrastructure could avoid more than $1.26 billion in flood damages over the next 30 years. It creates substantial socioeconomic benefits in terms of employment, but also beyond that, and not included in this assessment, for food security and sustainable livelihoods. And the combination of nature-based and hybrid infrastructure that was deployed by the DNP actually unlocks synergies, in that the sum of benefits is larger than what could be achieved with individual interventions. Now, the policy messages, and you can also find them in the story that is published and also in the report that is forthcoming, are essentially that nature-based infrastructure and built infrastructure should be combined, and or like that the hybrid approach to infrastructure planning should be considered, as seen in this assessment, because it can yield additional benefits. So strategically combining both parts of infrastructure essentially can yield synergies or benefits beyond what can be achieved with one individual type. As indicated earlier, it's important to consider knowledge not just from the DNP and us, but also from like sectoral experts, from infrastructure experts, from indigenous communities, to make sure that all the knowledge that is relevant to solving a problem is considered. So involving a diverse set of stakeholders pays back in terms of having a really sound information base for decision making. And then what we also found important is, on the one hand, additional investments in spatial data would help to improve the modeling for spatial, like for flood risk and flood management in the future. So investing in better spatial data could support the planning processes on the government side. And the establishing of climate resilient communities requires more than just infrastructure investments. So there would need to be emergency and evacuation plans, flood proofing and recovery plans, and disaster funds to kind of make the whole and make sure that what cannot be mitigated can be remediated. And with this, I want to thank you very much for your attention and give the word back to Lisbeth and some questions.
Thank you so much, Georg, for this comprehensive presentation. I think maybe for the few minutes we have for questions, feel free to stop the slide sharing. It's nicer that people can also see you in full. There's one question that came in from Jeroen in relation to the sustainable agriculture intervention, kind of the reasoning of why that's actually placed there, because that's a somewhat different type of intervention compared to the others that were taken into account. So what was the overall objective of the study? Was it looking at water safety or agricultural production?
It was both, because the agriculture production is very important. It's a very important livelihood in the La Mojana region. And what they wanted to know, given that some agriculture practices are a little bit more flood resilient than others and can generate yield benefits, they just wanted to know what that additional intervention would cause in terms of the socioeconomic impacts, because we knew that it wouldn't have a big impact on flood mitigation, but it would be more of a boost to local livelihoods in terms of additional production revenues.
So is this, Georg, is safe to say that that's something that came up in the discussions while you were looking at the region itself and what was happening there, in addition to mitigating flood risk?
Yes, that came up when we were talking about the impacts on agriculture and flooded land, and also on yields. So when we were validating the cropland and yield data with them, we also asked them whether their ambitions to engage in sustainable agriculture, because there's a substantial yield differential, especially if we talk about fruits. And so then they got interested and they say, okay, we can consider this, and we can just simulate it on top of it to see what would be the impact in socioeconomic terms.
Thank you. I don't know if there's more questions, and I'm realizing we're coming very soon up to the hour. Certainly these case studies and the deep dives are indeed deep dives and are meant to give an in-depth overview of the type of information that's used in these assessments and the outcomes generated. While perhaps a question here or there may pop up, just wanted to mention that this is a complement to our, I would say, general training modules on the different tools that Georg mentioned are part of the SAVi methodology. And there's lots of training materials available on the NBI Center website. I'll put a link in the chat here as well, in case you would like to review some of either the spatial model, spatial analysis, or some of the system dynamics components, the financial models, etc. We have those in different modules as well. There's a question from George on how difficult it was to reach an agreement for the mixed approach, for the hybrid approach. I don't know if you want to share some reflections on that.
So in essence, it was not too difficult because they were interested in looking at the more systemic approach, because most of the modeling that they had been doing was already spatial modeling. So there was a very strong spatial modeling component on the DMP end. And what was more challenging than the agreement reached on the mixed modeling is the definition of scenarios and what can be considered and what can be done and what kind of questions can we address with the service that we provide. So that was a little bit trickier, but ultimately, if you have an open exchange and manage expectations properly, then you will get to an agreement. Thank you.
Now, before we close, and this is an important remark for everyone in the room, we'd really like to have your feedback, and my colleague is going to post here in the chat the link to a very short 3-minute survey. It's not going to take more than that, but your feedback is extremely helpful for us to be able to improve the work, not only the training, but also the different assessments that we're working on. I'm going to the last question here, because it's a short one, perhaps, from Lena. The assessment is indeed very complex. I'll confirm that already. But how long does it take in total, and how does the length impact sometimes the willingness of authorities to undertake the analysis? If you can just give a short one there, Georg, that would be much appreciated.
So the average length of such assessments is between 3 and 9 months, I would say. I think this one took a little bit more than a year, which was due, but there were several aspects related to the data exchange, the sourcing of data, and so on and so forth, which made it a little bit longer than the other ones.
Thank you. So as we're up to the hour, I first really want to thank all the participants for being here and for your questions, and thank you also to Georg for his wonderful presentation and all the work on these specific assessments. Also, thank you very much, Becca, Morten, Eduardo, who are all here. You don't see them, but they are behind these assessments as well. So thank you very much. This was the second session in the series of 3, and our next one will take place on the 26th of April, where we will take a deep dive into the restoration of forests and next to a riverbed in Indonesia. And we really hope to see many of you there as well for a deep dive in that into that assessment. And we hope to see you all there with the kind of the same sharpness of questions that you have for us. Last piece of information to share is that, as I mentioned in my introduction, we're on that mission to evaluate as many of these type of projects as possible. And with the NBI Center, we can also offer these assessments pro bono, as we are receiving support from the GEF to undertake them. So if you or your colleagues, your organization is working on nature-based projects or on grey infrastructure where you think a nature-based solution attached to it would actually help its performance, then we'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to work with you. So thank you very much for being here and for working with us on this mission, and hope to see you in the next webinar.